may be saying to yourself right now, what is a channel about vintage technology and computers doing with a 1994 Geo Prism? Well, that's what we're going to find out about today, right here on Vintage Geek. Just a quick reminder, if you like what you see today, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us out a lot as we grow, and one of the things that helps us out the most is if you would consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial-free, plus some extra goodies and some cool merch and a whole lot more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Here at Vintage Geek, we have an extensive collection of vintage technology, everything from early vintage computers to things like Laserdisc players, home entertainment systems, and even video games. But one thing that we've never really gotten into is early automotive technology. You may have noticed that I am standing in front of a 1994 Geo Prism. And by all accounts, this looks like your standard run-of-the-mill mid-90s sedan. Nothing too fancy about it, other than the fact that it's very dirty, and I'll get into the reasons for that in just a little bit. But you'll find very quickly that this is not your standard Geo Prism from the time. In fact, I would venture to bet this is unlike any Geo Prism that you've ever seen. And I will show you why right now. The difference becomes apparent when it's time to fill her up. Yes, that's right. This particular Geo Prism is 100% electric. It was a conversion made by a company called US Electriccar, and I need to take a quick look back in history to talk about this particular company. It actually started back in the 1970s in Athol, Massachusetts. The concept was pretty simple. They would take factory-made cars like the Renault Electricar, and they would turn them into an all-electric vehicle by basically stripping them of all of the factory components and replacing them with an electric motor and a battery system. Most famously, US Electriccar made a car called the Electric Leopard in the 1970s. US Electriccar was pretty successful at doing these conversions, and in 1979 they were actually the largest producer of electric cars in the United States, with about 79 produced, believe it or not. By 1989, the company had actually rebranded itself as a company called Solar Electric, and they were still making conversion cars. In fact, they sold some of these cars to celebrities like Ted Danson and Kirstie Alley. In 1994, US Electriccar partnered with Hughes Electric Control, which was a division of Hughes Aircraft, to help produce a conversion of a Geo Prism, which we are in today, as well as a Chevrolet S10 pickup. The idea was to build a full production facility in Los Angeles to make these conversion cars. Back then, US Electriccar ordered 1,100 AC traction motors from Hughes Power Control Company in order to make these electric conversion vehicles. They also got a lot of the controller assemblies and things from Hughes, and ultimately it was a fairly well put together car and a well executed concept. But as far as I know, only about 200 of these cars were actually produced and sold, and most of them were sold to things like public utility companies and other government agencies. Because, as I've read, the price back then for a completed one of these cars was about $40,000. That converts to about $85,000 today, so this was not a cheap vehicle. Granted, it was a pretty new concept at the time, and actually General Motors had just used this same AC traction motor in their concept vehicle called the GM Impact, which later became the GM EV1. So in a lot of ways, this was a pioneer in the world of electric vehicles. And now you may be wondering, where did this particular Geo Prism come from? So we actually had the fortune in the past week to stumble upon a Facebook Marketplace listing that actually featured this car in it, but it didn't have a picture of the car itself. It had one of the early press photos of the US Electricar and had very limited information in the posting. But of course it piqued my interest immediately, and I had to check it out. We actually learned in the process that this particular US Electricar had been sitting for about the past decade, essentially in a field. The owner of this particular Geo Prism had acquired it from an institution in Chattanooga, Tennessee called the Advanced Transportation Technology Institute. That nonprofit organization was used in the 90s and early 2000s to test various electric vehicle technologies, and they actually have a test track in that area that apparently this car did many laps around during its life. I don't know much of the history of this car other than that and the fact that it has sat for many, many years, but the owner we got it from actually did have this car running back in about 2010. And the reason we know that is because there's actually footage that he took for an early YouTube channel that we are very thankful to have because it shows this car in motion, and it's pretty darn cool to see it running, even though it's just running around in a circle at a very low speed. So now let's take a closer look at all the components of our 1994 US Electriccar Geo Prism. When you open the hood on this Geo Prism, you really start to notice the differences between the production version of the car and this electric conversion. Everything is different in the engine compartment. And of course, as I just mentioned, this uses an AC traction motor from Hughes, as well as the entire controller system, which is the large silver box you see in the middle. Now, unfortunately, because this car has sat in the middle of kind of nowhere for the last decade or so, obviously it's been exposed to the elements and exposed to creatures and critters, and it is full of debris and all sorts of droppings and other things that are not great. I am not sugarcoating this. We just got this car, so this is not cleaned up in any way, shape, or form, and that is why it looks the way that it does. This is going to obviously pose a lot of challenges in trying to get anything to work in this vehicle again, but we are excited about the challenge nonetheless. There's a lot going on in the engine compartment of this car. The controller, of course, is the main focal point. From everything I've read about the vehicle, there was really nothing user serviceable within that compartment, but as you can probably tell, all the screws have been removed from this, and we have looked at the inside, and it is downright scary. There is a lot of debris in here, a lot of droppings, and a lot of wires that are probably either cut or chewed through, so it's going to take a lot of deciphering to get this thing put back together. There are some large connectors on the side of this particular controller unit. One of those is not currently occupied, and the reason for that is that that would have been the connector for the main battery pack of the car. Now, this goes back to 1994, so lithium-ion had not become a technology that was widely used yet, and the only real battery technology available at the time would have been standard lead-acid batteries. This particular vehicle actually uses 50 of those 12-volt deep-cycle batteries. Now, these were all installed in a tray that actually sits underneath the vehicle. So if you've noticed, the actual height of the vehicle is higher than a normal Geo Prism, and that is because right now the battery pack is not physically installed on the car. We did get it with the purchase, but it was actually in a different location, in a different field, and we are still trying to figure out the best way of picking that up and getting it to the car so we can put things back together. But chances are those batteries are not going to be usable anyway, since the date stamp on them was from 2006. So we're probably going to end up having to replace all of those batteries for any shot of this thing working again. Luckily, they do still make this battery, but whether that is going to be something cost effective, we have yet to find out. One thing I find interesting in the engine compartment as well is the actual throttle assembly, which you can see is kind of a pair of rheostats that are connected to the controller unit, coming from a cable that would come from the accelerator pedal. The car does have a small radiator in the front, probably for use with the heating and cooling systems. It also has power brakes, power steering, all the things that you would find in a standard Geo Prism from the time. So while this is a mess, I'm encouraged that we're going to be able to do something with this to demonstrate how the technology worked originally. Now, the stats on this car were not super impressive. It could get up to 70 miles an hour from what I've read, but that was really taxing the system, and it was very slow to get there. But the fact that you could get an electric car in 1994 that had a range of 70 to 90 miles is still pretty good in my opinion. And from everything I've read, the few of these that exist today, if they've been maintained and the batteries have been kept up, are still being used in many cases as daily drivers for work commutes and things like that. So I'm pretty impressed with the overall design. Hughes Aircraft obviously put a lot of engineering into this. Thanks to the Wayback Machine, we found a lot of documentation for this car, which is going to help us a lot as we are trying to put things back together. But I do want to ask that if any of you out there have any familiarity with the US Electriccar Corporation, this particular car, or if you have any familiarity with the systems that go into the US Electriccar, please reach out in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. It will help us a lot as we try to piece things back together. Our particular US Electriccar does have a couple of things missing from the other examples of the US Electriccar that I've found. One thing that we're missing is the inductive paddle charge system. Some of the examples on the web actually show a paddle charger slot behind the license plate in the rear of the vehicle, as well as some components that would have been in the actual trunk for an additional charging system. This particular model does not have any of that. Also, there's some reference to a serial port connection that exists on one of the controller units in the actual engine compartment that would connect to a piece of monitoring software where you could actually look at the battery health and various other performance indicators. I have not seen that yet, but I do know that there are parts of this engine compartment we have not gotten into yet. Obviously, we're in the very initial stages, so that may exist, and I hope it does, because that would be a perfect tie-in with some of the vintage tech we have in the museum. Now, as far as the interior of the US Electriccar, this is really your standard Geo Prism from the time. They did very little to change the actual interior of the car. It's actually quite comfortable for a mid-90s sedan, feels pretty normal to me. Now, the actual instrument panel is the same as the gas version of the vehicle, except two things. One is the US Electriccar badging that they've kind of put a sticker over the speedometer, which I find funny considering the price of the car at the time. And there is a difference in the fuel gauge in that they've added the state of charge indicator along with a little lightning bolt. So that would have actually shown you the state of the battery pack at any given time and give you an idea how long you would have before you'd have to essentially plug this into the charger at home. Now, as I mentioned, this particular model does not have the inductive paddle charger. If it did, it would have been able to charge the batteries in about 3 to 4 hours, as I've read. But as it is, we only have the onboard trickle charger option, which essentially uses home AC current at 110 volts, and I believe took from 8 to 10 hours to do a full charge. Still not bad if you're parking the car at home. You just plug it into a regular outlet, and then the next morning you are ready to go, essentially. The US Electriccar does have all of the normal features you would find in a mid-90s sedan. It has heating, it has air conditioning, it has a radio. So all of the things that you would be accustomed to, you could still have with the electric vehicle experience. Now, the actual shifter itself, it does have neutral and park though, and the neutral was very useful in making the vehicle roll so that we could actually get it on a trailer and get it out of the field that it was located in. So I'm pretty excited about the US Electriccar. I think that it's a great example of an early EV project and one of the companies that was at the forefront of producing electric vehicles at the time. Obviously, nothing like what we would see today, but it's cool to see the effort that went into this design back from 1994 and really did make something that would have been practical for daily use. Now, in a strange turn of events, it turns out that the US Electriccar was not the only electric vehicle acquisition that we were able to make in just 1 week's time, because another opportunity presented itself that, well, frankly, I could not resist. This is the Bradley GT2 Electric from 1981, and this was the most random find that I can possibly explain. So Bradley was a company that made kit cars back in the 1970s. They were pretty famous for making the Bradley GT, which was a conversion kit that you could take the chassis of a Volkswagen Beetle and essentially put this fiberglass shell on it that made it look like a really cool sports car. Now, Bradley, by the end of the 1970s, was kind of on the verge of going out of business, as I understand it, but their last foray into automaking was to make a version of the Bradley GT2 kit car that was made for electric use. In order to do this, they outfitted the car with a GE traction motor. This was actually direct current, not alternating current, and they used a series of 6-volt batteries to produce 96 volts, which could actually drive that particular motor. They still used the 4-speed manual transmission that would have come with the VW Beetle, and the rest of the kit was essentially the same as the Bradley GT2. We happened upon this particular car by total accident. Actually, my brother-in-law had seen a post on Facebook where someone had spotted this car at a scrapyard in North Carolina, just sitting there, and had posted, "Hey, does anyone know anything about this car?" And I immediately saw the picture that he had shared with me, and I said, "That's a GT2 electric. We have to figure out if that's something we can get, because it would be a great piece for the museum collection." So I reached out to the scrapyard, and sure enough, they were about ready to send this car to the crusher, and I was able to get in and save it at the very last minute. We made the trip to North Carolina to pick up the car, and thanks to help from a lot of the staff at the scrapyard, we were able to get this on the trailer and get it back to Tennessee, where we can take a closer look at it and hopefully get this at some point back on the road. Now, this is even more of a mystery to me than the US Electriccar project because there is very little documentation that exists. However, the systems themselves may be actually simpler because this is from a simpler time. The original configuration on this vehicle would have used 6-volt batteries to produce 96 volts total. but it looks like at some point whoever had this may have converted that, or it was a different version that we don't know about. There's a sticker on the back that actually says it's 144 volts, and the configuration of the batteries as we see them now indicates that they are using 12-volt cells, which could end up being 144 volts. So the whole system in this car may be different than the original factory kit, and we're going to have to do a lot of investigation to figure out how any of that works. But let's take a closer look at our Bradley GT2 Electric. Now, as you would probably expect, this car was in a scrapyard. Obviously, it's not going to be in the best of condition. I don't know how much of this is going to be salvageable in the end, but it's really fun to study regardless. Someone at the scrapyard actually pointed out that this uses bus lights as the tail lights, which is something that I actually love. In the engine compartment in the back, you can see the GE traction motor, and that would have been powered by DC. Some of the batteries are in the front of the car, some of the batteries are in the back, and there's a large wiring harness that terminates in a large connector assembly that would have connected to the motor and the controller unit, which I believe also came from General Electric. You can also see when you're looking at the back compartment that it's actually open through to the ground, so you can see directly past the DC motor, and it just kind of shows the overall simplicity of the design of this car. I assume there are a number of configurations battery-wise that could actually make this motor turn, so we have probably a lot of options to consider when we're trying to rebuild this car. And that is, of course, assuming that the frame is not completely rotted out, which there are some indications that the rust level in this is at a dangerous state. This may be more of a project than we'll ever be able to complete, but I'm hoping that we can at least give it a shot. And again, I would ask that if any of you out there have any familiarity with this car or have done any work on one of these, please reach out in the comments below. It's going to help us a lot as we are trying to sort this out. The interior of the Bradley GT2 Electric is tight. It is a very tight fit in here, but it's not terrible once you get inside. But it really reveals just how small this car actually is. If I move my head up at all, it's going to be going out the actual plexiglass top that is currently missing. So it's a little bit of a tight squeeze. But they do have a number of indicators that they've built into the car. The seats themselves are fairly comfortable, and you can see that there's an actual speedometer gauge. You've got several charge indicators. Now, one of these looks like it would have been original with the motor volts on the actual gauge, and then some were added after the fact, from what I can tell. Those are the ones that are on the steering column that actually have digital gauges of some kind. So I'm sure that over the course of its life, this car went through a number of iterations of different battery and control systems, and it was registered as late as 2011. So this car actually has a longer history on the road than you might expect. But one of the most interesting things about this particular car that I can tell you about is the fact that whoever owned it tried to add air conditioning in the weirdest way possible. The owner of this vehicle actually installed a home AC unit behind the driver's seat and then put a plexiglass sheet around it to keep the heat that would have come off the back of it in the back section of the vehicle, with a separate battery that it appears powered this unit. Now, I cannot imagine a situation where you would need that much air conditioning in this tiny vehicle, which admittedly you could probably just leave the top off of and get some breeze going through. But I don't know the application there. I just find it to be a very unique piece of engineering, and I have no idea what the thought behind it was, but it's very funny to see. In fact, to the point where I actually thought originally that there was just an AC unit being stored in the car or being moved by it, until I realized that it was actually physically wired to a battery in the back of the vehicle. So you just never know with projects like this, and I'm sure we're going to uncover a lot of things. As you can tell, the vehicle's extremely dirty. There's a lot of debris. We're going to have a lot of cleanup to do before we can even get started, but it's a really rare piece of history, and this is in fact one of only 51 Bradley GT electric cars that were ever made. So we're really hoping that we can get some kind of restoration going here, and that we can make this car available for the general public to see and kind of witness this early battery tech and an early EV concept. I made it. I hope you've enjoyed this look at our electric vehicle adventures here on Vintage Geek. We're going to keep you posted as we make some progress on these vehicles. As I mentioned, if you know anything about these cars, if you have any experience, please reach out. We would love to hear from you, and if you had anything to do with the companies that made these cars, we'd love to hear from you as well. I would also ask that if you enjoyed the content today, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us a lot as we grow, and one of the things that helps us out the most is if you would become a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial-free. We have bonus goodies, some cool merch, and a whole lot more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.